Welcome to the Tea Grannies. I'm Elise.
And I'm Maria. Today we're here for a deep dive into the fantasy genre, so pour yourself a cup of tea and let's get started.
We are here to talk about the only thing that matters. The fantasy genre.
Yeah.
I've been steeping. All of my training has prepared me for this. When I was, I think I've told you this story before, but when I was a kid, my parents sat me down at one point and let me know, it's great that you love reading so much. We love that you're so into that. That's awesome. Because, my brothers are over there playing video games and I'm, reading a book, stellar, A+ child. I go to therapy. But, so they sit me down.
We both do. We all do.
They sit me down and they're like, great that you're reading so much, but they're also kind of concerned. And they wanted to gently let me know about this concern that they thought I should consider branching out into maybe a couple other genres every once in a while. I don't know if they suggested any. I'm just here to say, and I'm not scared to admit it, I didn't. I lost my A+ status that day, I guess. I've never followed that advice. I'll read the occasional sci-fi or a nonfiction if my therapist makes me. And if you follow me on Storygraph or Goodreads, you know how it goes. So this is the perfect episode for us. It's the only thing I care to talk about is my entire personality. But before we jump into, we're gonna critique some first page like usual. Before we jump into all of that and our other notes, I'm going to start with kind of a high-level definition because I am aware and I accept the fact that not everyone is as into this as I am. But okay, what people generally mean when they say fantasy in the book world, there's the obvious nerd stuff like RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons and Lord of the Rings. But then there's also the less obvious stuff that some people are like, oh yeah, I guess that's fantasy, but it's not what comes to mind. So Howl's Moving Castle and Babel, which we both read recently. And it basically comes down to, does your story include magical elements? Either magic within the world, like people with magic powers or something like that, or magical creatures can also just make a story fall into the fantasy genre. And then everything else you add, just sprinkle in subgenre, and it's super fun, and you can do so much with the umbrella genre of fantasy. You can have fantasy stories that take place in made-up worlds, of course, but you can also have them take place on Earth or in an alternate version of our reality, so that, you can do kind of whatever you want. There are really very few limitations on this genre, which is probably why I like it so much. Absolute freedom. Even though I'm obsessed with rules, I don't know how that makes sense. But
Me too.
we are like this. We are the same in both of these ways. How does that work? I guess it's how we escape.
Other people like us.
How we escape from ourselves. I don't know. It's full escapism. That's all this is, and I love it. But yeah, I actually got into fantasy when I was 12, I would say. I was reading some tween world hopping books about these kids from Earth who fall into a medieval setting and have to learn how to sword fight and deal with magic and all this stuff. And it was just the absolute most fascinating form of escapism I had ever seen. So basically I read the series, I read it again back to back right away, and then I started writing my first book right after that. And one of the first drafts I ever finished was a world hopping fantasy novel about a female assassin who falls into the medieval world and also hits her head along the way, so she has amnesia when she gets there. Can you get any more cliche than that? But it was super fun because she wakes up and she doesn't know that she's an assassin, but she can do all these cool moves and stuff when she's learning to train with the other people in the training grounds, and she's just knocking people onto their asses. It's so good, super fun. I might dig that one out and refresh it later, but I've kind of moved away from world hopping stories and tend to prefer just starting and staying in the made up fantasy worlds over those kinds of things.
I would actually read that because I feel like things that are or were cliche when we were kids are making a comeback.
That's
sort of
fair.
How vampire books were making a comeback after Twilight was popular when I was in my teens, right?
Sure, that's true.
I was too cool for Twilight, in case anyone is wondering. So anyway, I was a total Harry Potter kid. And I don't want to call myself a Potterhead. I wasn't really that insanely into it. But it was the gateway drug, I suppose. But my obsession with fantasy did start a lot earlier than that. My mom used to read to me and my brother at bedtime, which was like my favorite time of day because I've always been a book nerd. And I was, of course, going through a unicorn loving phase.
Of course.
I think I was like 6 or 7 years old, probably 6.
Cute.
And so she picked a book called Into the Land of the Unicorns by Bruce Colville. And I was so impatient to know what happened next. I started reading over her shoulder, and that was when I started reading chapter books because I was like,
You're reading too slow, Mom.
Yeah, I was like, I need more than the world can give me at my age group. And yeah, that was that. So it took many, many years, but I do finally have a horse that is almost completely white, and she's my own personal unicorn, and it took a long time. The rude awakening that I got was unicorns sleep in their poop, and they are never as clean as you think they will be. So me and Ledoux spend a lot of time at the wash rack.
She doesn't stay pure white for very long.
She doesn't, no. But when she is clean, I'm like, gosh, you're beautiful.
Yeah, for like 5 seconds.
And then I come through the next day and her whole side of her face is green. And I'm like, you're still cute, I guess. But anyway, so fantasy was a very natural place for me to start writing. I actually wrote my first book, I guess we can call it. I remember it being in like, do you remember duotangs?
Yeah.
From, like back in the day, it was like in a duotang. And I called it The Tiger of Liberia.
What?
And it had illustrations about this tiger.
That is amazing. Did you draw them yourself?
Oh yeah, and it's so bad. Like my parents pulled it out like a while ago, and I was like, this is like embarrassing, but also really cute. But yeah, so fantasy for me was like, I just love having the freedom to shape the world the way I want it and not be forced to keep things accurate to real life. So I did end up taking a very long reading and writing break in my early 20s. And I actually got back into fantasy when we started the writer's studio together. And Elise recommended I read Inkheart, which I did, and I loved it. That was kind of what got me back into fantasy. I know.
My life's work. It was worth it.
That's your biggest achievement.
Yes.
But anyways, so that is the how and the why we love fantasy and how we got into it. And now we will stop boring you with our little stories and we will jump into our first page critique.
1. Sigyn. Sunsets were supposed to be pretty, but Sigyn only saw death. Standing atop the wall on the edge of Asgard, she watched blood, fire, and the infectious yellow light ooze over a battlefield of bruised blue shadows and dead brown tree branches. There was no beauty in that light. No beauty and no victory. Sigyn let out a curse and glared at the stones under her feet. "You failed me today," she informed them. "I'm going to pound you for it." She paced along the 30-foot thick wall, holding her fists up to her face and glaring at them, willing them to unclench. They had to unclench. She had to calm down before she go back down and re-enter normal society. Damn it! Sigyn aimed a vicious kick at the metal rail that poked above the edge of the wall. Her lips curved in a slight smile as it rang like a bell, but her pleasure only lasted a second. Sigyn huffed out a breath and faced Midgard again. Time to try the stupid calming exercise Papa insisted she go through. Step 1. Separate yourself from the situation. She was as far from people as she could get. Only Papa would climb the 100 feet to get here, and he and Uncle Odin were away doing their diplomatic wolf dung. Step 2. Separate what really happened from what you thought happened. Sigyn let out a growl and started pacing again, her feet slamming against the stones. The cooling air slapped her face like so many reprimanding hands. She was supposed to be with her brother right now. She and Skirnir had been trying to keep their cousins occupied, to keep their minds off the fact that their mother was in labor. But Thor would not stop asking his stupid questions, and finally, Sigyn had snapped.
So my overall comments, I love the opening lines. I think we get a good sense of Sigyn's view of the world right off the bat. I like the writing itself. And if I'd picked this up at a bookstore, I would have continued reading to the next page to see if the stakes get higher. So I could be wrong, but this reads a bit in a young adult voice, which is awesome if that's the plan and the goal. If the aim is for it to be more adult, I would advise I would advise a different way for her to show her anger and a little bit more internal dialogue about the situation she's in, so it reads a bit more maturely.
Yeah.
And what I found confusing about the first page is I thought we were opening at some point at the end of a battle or sometime later after a battle. And then when we get to the end, her aunt's in labor. So again, like, this is the first page. We don't have a back cover copy to give us an idea of what's happening. But to me, the stakes seem too low for how badass it opens. Like, I'm expecting like a battle scene or like the end of something and like some kind of big events coming. But that being said, I do love the setting, and I like that we got some familiar characters. And this is maybe a personal preference, so I mean, take this with a grain of salt if that's the same. Thanks to the Marvel movies, when I think of Thor or when I read Thor, that's what I think of.
Sure.
And I do think that this page would be stronger if he was left out and we get to sink into Sigyn's life and perspective before introducing the other well-known characters in this type of mythology. I think it would give the reader a chance to build up the world and get to know the main character instead of their brain kind of skipping to the Thor that most of us are familiar with, which is like jacked Chris Hemsworth.
Who doesn't like that? Yeah,
which is fine. That's great.
Nothing against a jacked Chris Hemsworth. All good.
Not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, I like that point. It's not like you're saying don't have Thor in there at all. It's just introduce him later so that he's not so distracting. Come on, Chris, back off.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that. I didn't pick up on that when I was reading, but that's a good point. A lot of my comments, I think, are similar to yours. Like, I really love the visuals in this piece and how bold and vivid those opening paragraph descriptions were. They felt super powerful. They made me feel like Sigyn was actually looking over an actual battlefield, or maybe preparing to go into a fight, or reliving memories of past battles that she had seen or experienced. Like, that was the vibe I was getting from all these like blood and an infectious yellow, and just the vividness of the colors. And I think the word battlefield was even thrown in there. And then also, I loved how like all-consuming her anger was, especially from a YA voice perspective. I feel like if that's what the author's going for, they nailed it. But again, like you, because of how vicious those opening descriptions are, vicious is a compliment. Just to be clear,
vicious is always a compliment. On this show.
Oh yes. I also, it made me feel like we were setting up for something big and bloody as the opening conflict. Like, I was expecting something on the scale of war and death, because like sunsets, but she only saw death. Like, okay, show me the bodies. Like, where are they? And so then when it came down to some family drama, her aunt's in labor, I deflated a bit. That was my internal reaction. Was like, oh, kind of disappointed. I thought this was going to be something more horrible. And maybe that's just me being a horrible person.
Something more horrible. I want something more horrible.
Give me something more awful. People tell me that I have dark humor, and, you know, that's very true. So take this with a grain of salt, because if this was a book in the store and I'd read the back cover, I might know not to expect something so bloodthirsty. Like, I might know that that's not what I'm getting into, and then I wouldn't have those expectations. But for the author to be aware that going into this blind, my expectations were put on this trajectory, and then the story actually felt like it undercut those, and that disappointment is not what you want for your reader. And then the other piece that's this is maybe getting at the heart of it. This is where to focus your edits if you're trying to fix this issue. Is I felt like we never learned why Sigyn was so angry. And we didn't learn that, and we need that information pretty early on in this first page in order to relate to her and empathize with her in any kind of way. And I didn't get enough to be able to do that. I wanted to see that information come in after the first couple of paragraphs, like in hints, bits and pieces. I don't need everything right away, but some hint of like, okay, what has sparked this anger? Who do we need to like just get angry at with her if that's what's going to happen? We need some hint of that, even if we don't get all the information. But as always, we're only seeing like a really brief snapshot into the opening chapter when we do these first page critiques. And to the author, I say this to my editing clients, I'll keep saying it, you know your story better than anyone. If our feedback doesn't feel right to you, please don't feel obligated to take it. Subjectivity and objectivity get really twisted when it comes to art. And we do our best, but the bias is just there. I guess as a closing note to this author, I would say you've got powerful descriptions and they are super strong and I love them so much. So if you can lean into that in your writing and if it fits your genre and the story you're trying to tell, by all means do. Don't shy away from that, and just keep going at it, because I think this could be really interesting, especially to anyone who loves Norse mythology. Like, with these names and everything, is very clear what the inspiration is drawing from, and there's a lot of fans for that. So there's a place for this, and I'd love to see where it goes. I'm actually really glad we started with a mythology-based piece.
Which was a total accident.
It was, and I love that so much. It's a serendipity. The fantasy genre is so massive, and there's so many subgenres that, like, we could talk about kind of the umbrella term for ages if we really wanted to. But I find it more interesting to start with the subgenres, to say that, like, look at all this variety, look at what you can do with it, now take it and run. And we were talking about tropes in episode 1 of this season. We went through lists and lists of them, which I'm sure was fun for some people. And I feel like mythology retellings are fascinating because of the built-in tropes that they have, just based on all of the mythology that we have to work with. There are certain expectations that mythology fans are going to have, and guidelines that certain ones you'll want to follow more closely than others, depending on your audience. And Mariah, you will speak into this way more and way better than I can, because one of your drafts right now is based on Greek mythology, which is super fun. But yeah, all that to say, there's this established lore that you're drawing from, and the average fan is going to know about it. So I just finished playing God of War on PlayStation, and that's all based on Norse mythology, but the main character, the God of War Kratos, is a character based on Greek mythology. So they're kind of like merging the two a little bit in this game. And I've never played any of the other God of Wars. Like, this is like the 6th one or something. And this was my first one. My husband was like, you might enjoy this. I think you'll really like the story, which is how he gets me to try games all the time. And then he just watches me suffer in combat. So
me, I can't do combat games.
It's a disaster. And he just laughs at me the whole time, and until I get like pissed off, and then
me and husband.
But it was super fun. I did really enjoy the story. My entire knowledge of Norse mythology is based around like the Marvel movies. Yeah. which I've hardly paid attention to, like, right? Really. I kind of lost track of all those more recently. But I've always found it super fun and super interesting, and every time I see a different iteration of it in a different world, it draws me in, it interests me. Same with Greek mythology. It's a heavily saturated market, which is what makes people kind of shy away from it a bit, I think. Yeah. But I think there's still space for it, and these stories keep coming out, right? Like, we saw so many Greek myths retold last year. I feel like there's so many, in the last couple years especially. And it was a bit of an issue when I was querying my Greek mythology story, because they were like, there was a lot of agents. I'd be like, this agent sounds like a good fit for me, and then I would get to their query form and it'd be like, no Greek mythology specifically. Just I was like, stab you in the back there. Like, nice. Way to get my hopes up. You sound cool. Damn. So there's always going to be some subjectivity around that, of like, some people are just done with it, some people don't care about it, some people were not obsessed with it as children like we were. But I've always found it absolutely fascinating, and partially because, like, it seems like made up nonsense in some ways, but Greek mythology was a pantheon established, and there were temples built to these gods in the real world. So, like, would people from back then just be completely baffled that we're calling this myth in the present day? Or would they get offended? Like, would they be like, how dare you dishonor the gods, dishonor on you? But that's my favorite part about thinking about Greek mythology. I think that too, actually. I've had that thought, if we had a time traveler from ancient Greece, they'd be like, what do you mean you don't worship the gods anymore? And I'd be like, well, Dionysus is still quite popular. But anyway, I have been really enjoying all the retellings of different myths, and while Greek mythology is still having its moment, we're starting to see more stories from other types of mythologies in mainstream fiction. So
Greek myths is always there. We're getting a lot more fantasy-based Arab mythology, Russian, and Norse. And all of them are unique and have so many interesting stories to tell. And I've obviously particularly enjoyed the feminist retellings that we've been getting. Those are super awesome.
Yes.
And I kind of always think that, you know, when people are like, oh, we don't need more feminist retellings in Greek mythology, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, we do, because everyone knows about Zeus, but who knows about like Artemis?
Not
and
me.
Like all the, and people know the, you know, the patriarchy version of Aphrodite, but there's so much more to Aphrodite than just being beautiful. So I really like seeing these stories and people's different takes on them.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a novel based in ancient Greece, and it relies heavily on the Greek gods and goddesses and the lore, but it also includes a lot of regular people characters, main like original characters, and I think a different take on Hades than we often get in fiction at the moment. And I did a project on Greek gods and goddesses when I was like 12.
Nice.
And that was like where it started, like the mad obsession. Like here's how my obsessions went. Titanic, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece.
I don't know how you got from Titanic to those, but the other two connect together.
Yes, the other two connect, but Titanic didn't. I was just like, wow, that's so fascinating. I was definitely that weird ass kid who knew like a lot of random facts about things. But anyway, what I was going to get to was the Greek mythology stuff really stuck with me even into adulthood. And so when my husband and I, when we were like 20, we went backpacking, which was awesome. And we spent 3 weeks in Greece. And it was really incredible to feel exactly how ancient it is there. Like just going around their ruins, the islands, the beaches. I just think like the ancient world's so fascinating. And I think that's why myth-based stories are so popular. It gives us a lot of the historical elements while keeping within the fantasy genre. Which leads me to a massive list of recommendations.
Maybe just pick a couple. That is huge.
No, I have to say them all. Okay, I'll try to be fast. Okay, so for Greek mythology, Medusa by Rosie Hewlett is amazing. Circe and Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. And Elektra by Jennifer Saint. Those are all fabulous.
Those are all Greek, yeah.
Yes, those are all Greek or Greek retellings. 1,000 Ships is about the Trojan War, like a feminist version of the Trojan War, and it's really, really good. For Russian mythology, we both read The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden and enjoyed that.
God.
That was fascinating. That was my first foray into Russian mythology, and I thought it was really cool.
Oh, another one that kind of might be more Polish than Russian actually is Naomi Novik does.
Right. Yeah.
They're similar enough. I think they might borrow some of the mythology or be related because there's just similar themes between them. Lots of cold winter random creatures that are super interesting. And yeah, so I think Spinning Silver of hers is my favorite.
Right.
But then there's also Uprooted, which I believe is set in the same world, if I'm not
both
mistaken.
of those are on my shelf and I haven't read them yet. Whoops.
So good.
Which I will get into our favorite recommendation from both of us.
Yes.
It's a truly amazing Arab fantasy, and it's the Daevabad trilogy by Shannon Chakraborty. So the first book is City of Brass, and this is like hands down the fantasy trilogy I recommend the most. The world building and the characters and the stakes, like it's perfect. And if you like that or you want something similar, there's also An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir, which is also really, really well done. And We Hunt the Flame. I'm not going to be able to pronounce their name.
Hafsah Faizal, I think, something like that.
Thank you. I did not want to butcher it. I actually haven't read that one yet, but it's on my shelf.
I've read that one and really enjoyed it. I haven't read book 2 because I read the first one, I think, before it came out, and then it lost track of the release date for the second one. But
happens
really
to the best of us. And if you want something that leans more young adult, The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah is very good as well. I would say it's like the YA version of City of Brass, essentially.
Okay, that one's on my shelf. The We Hunt the Flame is also YA, by the way.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
That's
Thank you.
Important note. For
See, I
those
forgot
of you.
that because I haven't read it yet. It's just been on my shelf for years, and I'm always like, you're going to be soon.
Yes. Oh, and yeah. I tell that to all my reads.
I tell that to all my books. Like, and they all look at me like, liar.
Liar. You've lied to me again. Yes. All right. So that covers mythology. I personally would like to see more Egyptian mythology specifically, because I feel like it doesn't get much attention, which is odd to me. And then,
I think it was one of those things, like, because it was so maybe so popular for so long, or people think it's overused, but I love Egyptian mythology too.
I guess I should say I haven't seen it in fiction.
Yeah, like, I think
I need to,
that's true.
Maybe I need to do some digging, because that could just be me not knowing. But yeah, I would be interested. If anyone has any recommendations, send them to us.
Please let us know.
We complain
I need more books to read.
I was just gonna say we complain about that all the time, but we're joking.
But also give us more.
Yeah, always. It's an addiction. Yeah. I'm not mad about it. No. Okay, so that, I think we're gonna move on into another subgenre that we kind of have to talk about this one, whether we like to or not. So
it's sort of like the main genre, if you will, the OG genre.
The OG is Father Tolkien with his epic fantasy, also known as high fantasy. So this is basically what people traditionally see as fantasy in general. Lord of the Rings, or you've got Brandon Sanderson or Steven Erikson. These are kind of some of the really big names in the epics. Game of Thrones is another one, but that will come up later, and we'll talk about it a bit more. So epic fantasy or high fantasy is usually characterized by kind of just super rich, complex world building in a completely made up world, especially with magic systems. Although, like, if you want to compare Tolkien with Sanderson, Tolkien's magic system is pretty much as vague as can be. I believe in the books as well, right?
Yeah, it's pretty vague in the books. Yeah.
While Sanderson, he like writes most of his magic systems like this comprehensive scientific theory. It's ridiculous. Like, he's got a whole glossary at the back that explains the different types of magic and how they relate to each other and how they work and what you can and can't do. Like, it is insane. I don't know how this man lives his life
with all that in his brain.
I don't understand. And he's got like multiple series and they work differently. It's wild. Absolutely wild. That can be overwhelming to a lot of people, which is why they don't necessarily lean towards epic fantasy. But from that, you can gather, like, your magic system doesn't have to be that detailed. It's more important for the world to be richly developed, and Sanderson does that too. Like, he just does all of it really well. But the magic needs to be a big piece of it, in some capacity at least. It just doesn't have to be as richly detailed as someone might think. So I could probably sit here and list examples of epic fantasy all day long. And I've already mentioned kind of some of the bigger names, and this is kind of, it's a big shock for me every time I realize it, because I know this about myself, but it surprises me every time. I don't actually read that much epic fantasy. We were talking about this earlier. Like, it's such a big commitment. It's usually 10 books long or whatever, and if they're not finished, you're going to be waiting for, I mean, how long has George R. R. Martin been sitting on that book?
I don't know. It's well over 10 years, I think.
I'm bringing up some trauma for some people with this one.
Yeah.
But my favorite example of something I've actually read is from Brandon Sanderson. It's his Stormlight archive. The first book is called The Way of Kings. And it's just absolutely amazing. Like, I'm not going to explain it to you. Go read it. You'll thank me later. It's amazing. I think he's in the process of writing book 5 with a planned series of 10, and book 5 wraps up the first arc, and then he'll go into another arc of the series. So you might get, I can't say this with confidence, but you might get more of a resolution at books 5 so that you're not waiting on such a bad cliffhanger, but no promises. He might just be a jerk about it. We'll see.
Might just gut you.
He might. It would be on brand. And then I'm just going to out myself here because I think this is kind of hilarious. I've never finished The Lord of the Rings, reading them. I've watched the movies a million times. You can't even look at me right now, but I could not get through book 3. I could not do it.
Do it on audio.
Okay, you've told me this before.
Yes, the audiobook is really great.
I tried.
It's very immersive.
So this was before I started. Like, I used to never stop reading a book if I started it. Like, I felt like that was the greatest sin on this earth that I could commit. So if I started a book, I would religiously finish it, even if I hated it. I'm recovering from this issue. But Lord of the Rings, when I read it, was during that phase of my life when I just felt horribly guilty about putting a book down. I tried reading it twice. I started and restarted because I couldn't remember anything. And I was like, I can't do this. Tolkien, like, why are you so regaled as this amazing writer when I just cannot push through another paragraph about this fucking tree? Just leave off the tree, man.
I will say The Two Towers is the best book of the series, in my opinion. I think the pacing of that book is the best.
Yeah.
And The Fellowship of the Ring is like, you know, you get the same vibes from book one as you do as from the first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, I'll jump to my little Lord of the Rings pitch. If you're listening to Elise and you're like, I'm not going to read Lord of the Rings, I would like to say that you read it anyways, or try it for yourself. It is not for everyone, just like every book. But I think if you're writing high fantasy and you haven't read Lord of the Rings, you probably should.
At least the first book. Like,
at least
I read the first
book.
one. All right.
Yes.
If I got through Elrond's counsel, you can too.
You can do it too.
It's a lot of pages, but you got to do it.
And I do love that you brought up the tree thing, because I was going to make a joke about that. But I actually kind of love that he describes the trees, because I went into Lord of the Rings knowing it wasn't very fast paced. Like, I would almost like, where the stakes not so high, like it feels cozy at times. Oh, yeah. So I think that's why, like, when I went into Lord of the Rings, I was like, this is not going to be a fast-paced adventure. And I think that really helps.
That does.
So I also love epic fantasy, but I also don't read it a lot because it's the same thing. Like, I don't know what is going on for the first like 50 to 100 pages generally. And sometimes I'm just not in the mood to be that confused right off the bat. But sometimes I'm like, yes, like, it's so good. So there's usually a lot of world building, and there's often a big cast of characters in epic fantasy, which is where I really get lost. So I like authors that provide a character list. Thank you, because then I get to a chapter and go, who is this guy again? And I can check. My forgetful self salutes you. So if you're writing an epic fantasy, I suggest you do that.
Hot
like
tip.
Just for yourself, but your readers would probably appreciate it too. And make some maps and stuff too, because often when you get into that big of a world or that rich of a world, you're going to need something to help keep your location straight and where things are and directions if you're directionally challenged like myself. But the other book that I really recommend is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon.
Yes.
So that is a beautifully done high fantasy. And I liked the way there's like 4 different storylines, and the way they all come together in the end is great. Magical. And one of the main characters, who's not a POV character, but one of the main characters, I actively disliked her at first, and then I came around to liking her so much in the end.
Oh, that's fun.
So yeah, so I really like that book. It gives you a lot of different emotions, and like, it was a big one to tackle because it's huge. Yeah. And I did it as a buddy read with some Bookstagram friends, and I'm really, really glad I finally did it. So recommend that one for sure.
Love it.
Yeah.
All right. So we were talking about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings being like borderline cozy, probably because of the hobbits. Like, that just, it's gonna feel cozy. It's hobbits. What do you want from me? So we're gonna just jump off of that into the complete opposite of that. We want to talk about dark fantasy, which is horror adjacent. And while mythology was kind of like Mariah's bread and butter back there, this is mine. And it's not like, I would say that my stuff kind of skates on the fringes of dark fantasy because I'm a giant coward. So, I mean, everyone's threshold is different. You do you. Who knows? But yeah, dark fantasy, I find it an interesting one to talk about because in a lot of the reading that I've done and what I've experienced of it, the lines are really blurred on what that subgenre actually is. And like I said, everyone's threshold is different. What's too dark for some people is like child play to someone else. Whereas I feel like when you talk about the romance versus dark romance genres, there's some clearer lines about what's considered dark and what's okay and what's not in a regular romance versus a dark romance. But when it comes to fantasy, it's like anything from mildly unsettling kinks to straight up horror. The range is broad. So I may not be the best person to talk about this because I've never read like just straight up horror. I read one sci-fi horror once and it scarred me for life. Couldn't do it again. So
I read a book once that my dad lent me, and he was like, "Don't read it before bed." And I was like, "Okay, wimp." And it was like a James Rollins book. I can't remember the name of it. It was based in the Amazon. I read it before bed and I laid awake all night, terrified.
Yikes. Oh my goodness.
I was also in my 20s at the time. It's not like I was a kid or something. So yeah, I also don't go that way.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna give some book recommendations on this, and they're gonna be my style of dark fantasy, which is to say not super heavy. Like I would say Steven Erikson, who I mentioned before in the epic fantasy genre, his stuff is gritty and dark and kind of gross at times. Like it just makes you feel kind of ick, and it, like, he does it really well is what I'm trying to say, but it's not for everyone. Some people are just like, that is too gross for me, I can't do it, and some people stop reading because of that. So I would classify his as probably dark fantasy as well. I couldn't get through his Malazan series. It was too confusing. Basically, didn't know what was going on for the first 5 books, and they're all like massive, and I was like, okay, I just can't put myself through this anymore. But the recommendations that I have here are not going to be on that level. I'm going to go with Witch King by Martha Wells, which just came out. I listened to the audiobook. I was telling Maria I was kind of only half listening for the first chapter or two, so I got really confused and lost and had to figure out what was going on.
Fantasy. You're like, wait, what just happened?
But it wasn't because of the book itself. It was because of me being a dumbass and not paying attention. But when I got like further into it and figured out more about what was going on, it was really good, really interesting. It felt so unique to me. Like it was just really fascinating. But it's dealing with demons and witches and kind of soul body possession. I don't know. It's very interesting. Okay. But I think that's what makes it dark, less more so that than anything actually really gritty or gross. Although there's like some, gore and whatever, but it didn't feel that. My threshold is where it is, and it didn't feel that bad. It didn't cross it. And then the other one that I have here is Book of Night by Holly Black. Also listened to the audiobook for this one and just really enjoyed it. It was a pleasure to read. It didn't have the issue of confusion because this one was more deep POV, one POV character.
Oh, that's a little easier, yeah.
And it was just really good, really interesting. Very different from what I was expecting because I've read her some of her other work, which is like The Cruel Prince is one of hers, right? And that was very YA. This is more like new adult, young, straying into adult, I think, with the character's age. And then it's also an urban fantasy, so it's more closer to present day. It's just, it's very good, but it's considered dark fantasy. And if you like kind of darker, more mysterious vibes in your stories, then that's another one to check out for sure.
Yeah, so I tend to shy away from this genre because I am a scaredy cat. And I like happy endings. So not that they can't have a happy ending, but they don't tend to be that happy. So so my only recommendation is Roots of Blood by Elise. Because when I read that in our writing group, I don't want to spoil it. So one of the scenes, Elise knows which one I am thinking of. I was traumatized.
Well, that happens like right at the beginning. You can spoil it.
Yeah, it happens pretty quick. And I was like, holy crap, I hope the rest of this book doesn't scare the shit out of me as much as this did. But it doesn't. It's very good. And the other, addition, I would say, or what falls under dark fantasy, something called grim dark fantasy. This tends to be like a little bit more violent and has like dystopian like themes at times. So if you've read or watched Game of Thrones, that's grimdark. I actually stopped reading that, I think, on book 4 because the amount of rape and torture was just too much for me. I lost interest in how it was going to turn out for the characters because, honestly, I could go off on an absolute rant about this. I don't think that much rape is necessary in any book ever. And I think at that point it was for shock value, and I got like halfway through and I just shut the book and said, I'm done with this. So it really depends on your tolerance level for it. Mine's pretty low, so doesn't work for me.
But that's why our next subgenre is for you. You are like, oh, I literally have no notes for this. This is just all you. I'm gonna clear the way, pave the way for the queen of romantasy here. Take it away, co-host. Here you go. This is about we're doing another like whiplash moment for the listeners here. Like we went from cozy fantasy discussion to a dark fantasy horror, and now we're right into romance. So go for it.
Well, of course, this has a huge section because I love it. So yeah, if you're on Bookstagram, especially, you will see a lot of romantasy or romance and fantasy mashups. Mm-hmm. So within that genre, there's a lot of popular tropes, which we did talk about in the tropes episode. But I think the ones that you see the most that almost kind of define this subgenre, for me at least, is enemies to lovers, of course. One bed, one horse, which, by the way, guys, doesn't work in real life, but whatever. Enemies to lovers, back to enemies again. That's always fun. Mates or fated mates, found family. All of those are really strong in this subgenre. And I would almost say that there's a subgenre, if that's the right word, for fae or fairy fantasy, because that's really taken off in the last, decade, maybe longer. But yeah, so romantasy tends to lean one way or another. We got kind of plot driven with a strong romance component, or romance driven with a strong plot component. So if you don't see it that way, I mean, sorry, but that's how it looks to me when I'm looking at books. So a good example of a plot-driven romantasy with a strong romance component is The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. This is a vampire romantasy with strong Hunger Games vibes, and it was really fun to read. The trials and the main characters' struggles are the meat of it, but the romance is still pretty strong, and it takes the lead in some parts. And if you want something that's more romance-driven, I would recommend my favorite, The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy by Megan Bannon. It's like You've Got Mail with zombies, and if that's not enough to sell you...
Oh my god, that's the best mashup I've ever heard. That's perfect.
Literally the best.
That is it's such a good book.
And there's an underlying mystery, there's still some plot, but their romance is kind of front and center, and it's just amazingly well done. And I was squealing when I finished it, so read it. And I guess, romantasy is pretty self-explanatory, so I guess I don't have to describe more of it, but I'm going to get into my recommendations, aside from the two I just recommended. This is my whole section is book recs. So these are some of the popular ones that you will see on social media a lot, is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, as well as her Throne of Glass series. So Throne of Glass is definitely falls into high fantasy as well, I would say. They're both with fae, and they both have a lot of romance, but they have a big overarching plot. So they're good. They're classics for a reason. But if you don't like her writing, don't make yourself read it. An underrated one is The Winter King by C.L. Wilson. And I swear it's only underrated because it has the most 80s romance cover. But it is such a blast. There's romance, weather mages, politics. It's really underrated. I honestly think if she got a cover upgrade, that thing would be everywhere.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. And if you want to go for YA romantasy, I would go with another book series by Holly Black, which is the Folk of the Air trilogy. And the first book is The Cruel Prince. Not big on YA, but I did binge this series and I loved it. And lastly, at some point, my romantasy books will be out in the world at some point. Maybe in 2024, if I can just rip off the Band-Aid and stop being a little baby.
You will.
I will. It's going to happen eventually. It's getting to the point where I'm I either better publish these or just
We're going to get you there. That is my solemn vow to you. Next up is contemporary fantasy. And I was going to say that, this section's going to be short because we don't have much experience with this one. But I actually read more of this than I thought I did and enjoy it more than I thought I did. I used to be the fantasy snob. It wasn't good fantasy if it was set in real-world contemporary places because who wants that? The whole point of fantasy is to be somewhere you've never been. But like, can you get worse than that? No, you cannot. Don't have that attitude.
Hey,
it's
we were
not
all
a good one.
snobs until our frontal lobe finished developing at 25, okay?
And we're still snobs about some things. It's fine.
Yeah, there's still a few things.
All that to say, I have some recommendations for this subgenre. Read them and love them because I did, and I'm pretty sure you will too. My top two are Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, which is like a dark twist on Harry Potter with a female main character instead, and it's just a riot.
And she's grumpy too.
Oh, so grumpy. Oh my god!
I'm like, give me more grumpy women.
We don't have to be
so
much joy.
Bubbly.
Oh
yeah, good.
Yeah. I love that character so much. And then it's a grumpy sunshine. Enemies to lovers. Back to enemies. Back to lovers. You find out. Read it and find out. It's great. And then I already said this one, but Book of Night by Holly Black is just a delight. And I think it's something about when it's done well, the balance of bridging real life and magic and making it feel like this could actually happen or something like that, or making me think about what would life be like if this could happen. I just find that so fascinating. And I think like when I was a teenager, the first book I read in this genre, I don't know the author or the title. So if some freakish superhero librarian can tell me what this was, I will be eternally grateful. But it was about these kids. It was set in London, I think, and there were these stone statues that they were trying to get away from all over the place, and like they had to do some magic nonsense. It was just fascinating. I think it was probably a YA, but yeah, super great. And that is a nice bridge to get us into the subgenre of contemporary, the subgenre of contemporary fantasy that I want to talk about.
We're taking this really far.
Which is urban fantasy, and that's usually set in a large and recognizable real life city. It's like London or Paris or whatever. And it's kind of like, I think what makes it so interesting is kind of like the blend between historical and fiction, because you can take all of this real life stuff, places that exist, things that actually happened, and then just
drop some magic in there.
Yep, just
how would this have been different
mess with literally everything. It's a delight.
I kind of like that. Yeah, and for me, like urban fantasy tends to be stuff like set in our real world, but with like werewolves or shifters. There's like fated mates, witches, that kind of stuff. So everyday world, but magical elements. One book that I read that I liked, that, I mean, I'm not a big urban fantasy reader, so someone recommended Wolf Gone Wild by Juliet Cross, which has like really strong romance elements, and that's an urban fantasy with like werewolves and witches, I believe. And I enjoyed it. It was a reading slump buster. And then there's also Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young, and this one is like I almost don't want to call it a fantasy, but it is called a fantasy. And it's set on like a small island, like off the coast of Washington. So it's very atmospheric, and it's a very good book. She's a great writer. I quite like that one. Yeah. And that leads me into the next one.
Really actually.
Really well. Cozy fantasy, which is having its moment right now as well, as it should. Essentially, it's fantasy, but lower stakes. So sometimes there's a dash of romance or some soul searching, some funny ones. The most popular one that's been around lately that I actually really do recommend, because it actually is really good, is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. It's on your shelf. Yep. It feels like someone you love just gave you a big hug and then handed you a perfectly made latte and told you to go sit down, put your feet up. That's how that book felt to me. And that's how cozy fantasy feels. There's another one that I read. I was in a reading slump last summer, and I bought a book called That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon by Kimberly Lemming. And I heard it was funny, but I was like, I'm actually kind of hard to please. Like,
you weren't expecting much from it, I remember.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting much.
Try it.
And then I sat there on my patio and like cackled like a mad woman. Finished it an entire afternoon, and I'm pretty sure like my neighbors could probably hear me laughing. Like this, like they already think I'm insane, so they must think I'm extra insane. And it was cozy too, because it was very romance driven, but there was like an underlying plot. And they're the kind of books that you put down and you're like, oh, that was so like heartwarming, funny, and I like that, and no one dies generally. I would say that's the main thing, or only the bad guys die, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's good when you're not feeling so great about your life or yourself. Those are definitely the books to read.
Yes. I love the idea of cozy fantasy. And like, okay, I love it so much that I set out to write one. And it was going to be like, the way I pitched it to, like, I think I told you this and I told my husband this, like, I'm going to write this book. It's all about this girl just trying to find her family. There's going to be no murder, no death, no nothing. I get like 10 pages in and I'm introducing this poison plot that decimated like an entire room of nobles.
Like, let's kill everyone.
Everyone. Literally, I can't get through a book that
I know
I'm
which
writing
story you're
without,
talking about.
yes,
And that's
do.
a great, it almost still ends up being kind of cozy. Has cozy elements.
Yep, pretty much. I don't know why, but that's just how I work.
Does.
Maybe I need to read more cozy fantasy to really get into the right headspace. But yeah, so when we were chatting about this, I haven't read Legends and Lattes yet. But it's on my shelf. I intend to. So the only one I could think of, there's a couple that are coming to mind now, actually, but they're kind of other subgenres. But Howl's Moving Castle is the only one that, like, you kind of suggested to me as one that feels like cozy fantasy. And I don't know if anyone else would classify it as such, but I think one of the reasons that it feels so cozy is because it is middle grade and meant to be pretty soft and like heartwarming, wholesome reads that just make you feel warm and fuzzy all over and you want to read it again and again and again. If that's all it takes to be cozy fantasy, more of that, please. But the other ones I was thinking of are The X-Hex, which is a contemporary witchy fantasy, but it feels very cozy.
It does, yeah.
Really cozy witchy vibes all the way through. Super fun. And then another one, which we'll talk about, I think, in a minute, is Half a Soul. Felt really cozy to me, even though there was a lot more going on there and a lot more kind of dark parts, I guess, but overall it had cozy vibes.
Yeah, I would actually call that a cozy fantasy. Like, and it has like a nice romantic element too. It's like sort of like Howl's Moving Castle with fairies.
Yes.
Very similar.
Did you need anything else to make you go read it immediately?
Yeah.
No, go.
It's
what are
really
you doing?
good.
Stop what you're doing now and go.
You love it.
Yeah, but from there, that kind of wraps up most of the subgenres, but we're just gonna kind of blitz a few of the miscellaneous ones, if you will.
Subgenres.
Subgenres. Because we've already we're gonna get into Fae fantasy. So we were just talking about Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. There's Fae elements in that, and then you've got ACOTAR and everything by S.J. Moss, of course. But there's so much Fae fantasy out there, and it's often a blend of genres and stuff. Like The Cruel Prince by Holly Black is also contemporary fantasy because it takes place in
that's right,
present day times. But then you've got Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson, and that's completely medieval. So yeah, there's so much
so good
variety in the Fae fantasy that you can spend a lot of time there if you want.
You can. It's a massive subgenre or subgenre, whatever we're going to call it.
And then the other one that we haven't really touched on is dark academia fantasy, which I did mention Babel by R.F. Kuang earlier. And that's another one that stopped talking with us immediately and read it. And
that one was fantastic and intimidating to read because there's actually you do quite a bit of learning.
And there's quite a few characters and it's a big book. Like, it's long.
It's a big book.
So that's another one that the only reason I got through it was because we did a buddy read with all those bookstagrammas. Shout out to all of you, because I would not have finished it if we hadn't done that. And I'm so glad I read it. It's like one of my top reads of the year. So yeah, big recommendation for that one for sure.
Yeah. And then a couple other ones, lesser known, I guess, would be the science fantasy. You don't see too many of those, but an example of that would be Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. I read that on audio and it was great. Gideon's internal dialogue is like so funny. I just really enjoyed it.
And that's when like science fantasy, you won't see any labels for that in bookstores or anything, and you likely wouldn't want to even classify your work as that if you were querying, because it's not really a recognized genre from a lot of standpoints.
No, it's really not.
There's some debate about it, about whether like you have to be either science fiction or fantasy. You can't have a blend, and everyone's like, but it's always a blend. Like, just look at Star Wars for a minute.
Exactly. Like, exactly. I won't get into my rant about that now. And then we get into fantasy mystery, which is like, as I recommended earlier, Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young.
Fun.
And then adventure fantasy, or you could call it nautical fantasy, because it's also having a moment right now.
Yes.
And the top recommendation for this is another one by Shannon, ChakrabortyAn. It's called The Adventures of Amin al-Sirafi. And I freaking loved that book.
Yes.
It was so good that when I finished it, I had a second copy and I literally put it in the mail and sent it to Elise.
You did.
I was like, you need to read this now, and you haven't read it yet. Ugh.
I'm a few chapters in and working on it slowly, but I'm in such a slump right now that it's just like
it's hard, yeah. And it's a big book as well.
It is, but it's fascinating.
Another nautical fantasy that I would recommend is Fable, also by Adrienne Young.
Yeah,
that was a good one. Like it's the fantasy elements are pretty like laid back, I guess. But it's also definitely like a nautical one. And it was really fun. I quite enjoyed that. And again, young adult. So I'm really fussy about young adults. So
I used to be obsessed with nautical fantasy. Like I wrote how many different stories based on that? I had several that you've never seen because they're
now I want to see them.
Horrid trash and they will never see the light of day. But that used to be like, that was the thing. It was always as soon as I think it was as soon as I watched Pirates of the Caribbean. Now it's like nautical fantasy everything. So I have one. It's a tween fiction. The name of the author is escaping me. It's called Isle of Swords by, I think it's Wayne Thomas Batson. And that and Pirates of the Caribbean together was like, well, now nothing else in my life matters. Obsessed. Now this is my entire personality.
And I like nautical books because I'm the kind of person who gets motion sick as a passenger in the car. Going on boats is like the worst thing ever. The amount of times I have vomited in many oceans. No. Apologies to the Great Barrier Reef. I would have loved to see more of you, but I spent way too much time puking my guts out, which is probably TMI for everyone who's listening. But now you know why I like to read them, because I'm living vicariously through these characters who don't get motion sick.
That's where you're going.
I'm so jealous. I'm like, this sounds badass. I love this. I could never. They're talking about the boat like rolling. I'm like, oh yeah, no.
Oh, you're gonna
work for me.
I have a little secret shout out to you in my latest draft of Bug Babies. I made Triton is seasick. He gets seasick whenever he takes a boat because he's a big baby.
That's me. Yeah. My dream trip is the Galapagos Islands, and my husband will not go with me unless I can come up with some way to be on the boats, because you can't help a boat on that trip. So he's like, if you can find something that works for your motion sickness, we could go on that trip. And not a minute before that.
That's funny.
Poor guy. He's had to guard my passport loads of times while I'm vomiting. Anyway, that was a very off-topic conclusion. Nautical fantasy is super fun.
Yeah, dive into that. Now that we've added to everyone's endless TBR, I'm sure you'll thank us for that. You're welcome. But we've been nattering on for a good solid hour here. We'd like to hear what our listeners think of the fantasy genre. I know not everyone is as nerdy about this as we are. Some people are like, I don't read fantasy. I don't know how you live, but you do. And that's fine. I will accept it.
Come to the dark side someday. And read some of our recommendations.
MillerA won't accept it. You just need to dive in. But we'd like to know if you are into fantasy, what are some of your favorite subgenres? And like, what subgenres did we not talk about that you'd like to hear about? Because if we get enough ideas and suggestions, we might have to do a part 2 of this episode. We might have to read some books to brush up on our knowledge, but that's always
add
a fun
to our
time.
TBR
so,
too. Like you
back.
have to return the favor.
Do, please. We'd love to hear from you. Send us a message or an email, mention us in your tweets publicly, share in your stories on Instagram and tag us, be obnoxious, slide into our DMs. That's all to say we love hearing from all the other book nerds among us, no matter what platform, and don't be shy. I'm sure we would just love to get a message from you.
We would. And that's the tea on fantasy and its subgenres, or subgenres if you want to get really specific. Don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram at the Tea Grannies Podcast or on Twitter at the Tea Grannies. We'll see you next time. Happy writing.